My name is Audrey Bennett. I am 33 years old. While I was standing in a sterile hallway at Seattle Children's Hospital after a 14-hour shift in the pediatric oncology ward, my mother sent a forged email to my wedding coordinator at Cedarwood Mansion, claiming I had agreed to turn my private ceremony into a double wedding for my cousin Cassidy Thorne, effectively selling the only day I had ever claimed for myself to cover my cousin's $31,000 in credit card debt without ever picking up the phone to ask me if I was willing to sacrifice my marriage for her vanity. I stood there in my scrubs, my hands still smelling of sanitizer, and the heavy silence of a hospital at night, watching my phone screen light up with a forwarded message that proved the woman who raised me saw my happiness as nothing more than a liquid asset she could trade to keep her sister's favor. I stood in that dimly lit hospital corridor, staring at a professional email that turned my future into a transaction my mother made behind my back while I was busy saving children's lives. If you have ever been the invisible pillar of a family that only notices you when they need to lean on your bank account, please take a second to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Because that email was only the first page of a much larger betrayal. I need you to understand the world I lived in before that night. A landscape of quiet exhaustion and professional competence where I was the most reliable piece of financial infrastructure my family ever owned. My mother, Beverly Bennett, 58 years old, a high school librarian in Snohomish County, Washington, had spent her life surrounded by the hushed order of books. But in our family, she was the primary architect of a chaos that always seemed to require my salary to resolve. For 7 years, ever since I earned my degree and became a registered nurse, I had been the silent partner in her survival, starting with small requests that eventually became the foundation of my own financial imprisonment. It began in 2017 with a $400 check for a leaky roof, then $600 for an insurance gap, and then the numbers began to swell with a surgical precision that I was too exhausted to question. There was the $8,500 for a down payment on a Toyota Camry for my cousin Cassidy Thorne, 31, a medical esthetician, because my mother swore that without a reliable car, my cousin would lose her position at a luxury spa in downtown Seattle. Then there was the $12,000 for my mother's basement remodel, and the $7,200 for my younger brother Grant Bennett's HVAC certification program when he was 20, a deposit my mother insisted had to be paid by Friday or he would lose his place in the trade school. Every time I felt the weight of my own life pressing against my savings account and tried to hesitate, the family playbook ran like clockwork, beginning with my mother's tears and the reminder that I was the oldest with a stable career, followed by a cold week of radio silence that made the quiet of my Seattle apartment feel like a sentencing. Finally, my aunt, Evelyn Thorne, 62 years old, the owner of a high-end boutique in Bellevue, would call me in that low, disappointed tone to ask if money was really more important to me than the peace of the woman who had raised me. Somewhere around 2019, I started logging every wire transfer, every Venmo, and every check in a private Excel spreadsheet on my MacBook. A habit of the job because as a senior nurse, I was trained to track vitals and infusion rates with absolute accuracy. I told myself I was just managing data, but in reality, I was building the only place where the truth existed exactly as it happened. A 14-page record of a family that saw me not as a person, but as a slush fund with a nursing license. If I was the family's silent ATM, my cousin was its golden trophy. A woman whose life was a curated masterpiece of Instagram stories, boutique hotel lobbies, and Bellevue brunches that suggested a six-figure income she didn't actually possess. My mother would nudge me under the table at every holiday gathering, telling me I should try to dress more like my cousin or learn how to work a room, never mentioning that the very clothes my cousin wore were often funded by the overtime shifts I pulled in the oncology ward. The moment that branded itself into my memory happened during Thanksgiving 2023 at a rented venue in Kirkland, an event that I paid for in full, from the organic catering to the handcrafted decorations totaling $3,200. When my aunt stood to give a toast, she smiled at my mother and thanked her for putting together such a beautiful evening, never once mentioning my name or looking in my direction, even as I sat there holding my fork and smiling, because that was what I had been trained to do. Elliot Graham noticed the discrepancy immediately, and as we drove home past the glowing Seattle skyline, he turned the radio down and asked why no one had bothered to thank the woman who had actually provided the meal. Elliot Graham, 35 years old, a partner at an architecture firm, was the first person from outside the Bennett orbit who could see the architectural flaws in my family's loyalty. A man who built structures meant to last and was horrified by the way mine was being dismantled. In October 2024, he asked me to marry him at Cary Park, looking out over the Space Needle and the Puget Sound while the Pacific Northwest mist settled on our coats. And he didn't give a speech about what I could do for him. He just told me I was the first person he'd ever met who didn't need a reason to be loved. And we chose Cedarwood Mansion in Woodinville wine country as our venue, a place with ivy-covered stone walls that felt like a sanctuary. The full package was $28,000, and we signed the contract in November, putting down a $14,000 deposit while the coordinator walked us through the cancellation clause. I remember her tapping the paper with her pen, explaining that we could get 80% back if we canceled 8 weeks before June 14th, and I nodded politely, never imagining that I was signing the only document that would eventually set me free. The change began on March 12th, a Wednesday evening when the rain was drumming against our windows, and we were scrolling through our shared wedding email, looking at florist quotes and RSVP lists. My husband-to-be stopped mid-scroll and showed me a forwarded message from the venue coordinator that asked for confirmation on a second reception that had been requested by my family. Beneath the coordinator's polite inquiry was the original email from my mother, a letter where she introduced herself as my family representative and stated that I had agreed to share my wedding date and my ballroom with my cousin to split the costs for a double celebration. I read the words, "Audrey has agreed to this arrangement," and felt my vision tunnel, my hands shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone. Because no one had called me, no one had texted me, and no one had even hinted that my wedding was being sold to cover my cousin's credit card debt. When I finally reached my mother on the phone, she was breezy and dismissive, telling me she was going to tell me, and that since my cousin had just gotten engaged to a real estate agent, it only made sense to share the Woodinville venue to save money. She called me selfish for wanting my own day, the woman who had taken $83,000 from me over 7 years, telling me that I was the one who didn't understand the meaning of family. I hung up and sat in the dark of my kitchen, the only light coming from the blue glow of my MacBook as I opened the spreadsheet and tallied the final total. $83,247. I stared at that number. Then I looked at a second column I had titled, "Amount Family Has Spent on Audrey," and I typed a 0, remembering my birthday the previous year when no one had even bothered to send a text. The next morning, I called a friend from the University of Washington, Sarah Bennett, 36, a family law attorney. And she told me in a voice as sharp as a scalpel that my mother had misrepresented my consent to a third-party vendor. She told me to save everything, every email and every Venmo screenshot. And I spent the next hour making the 3 most difficult calls of my life. First, to the coordinator to invoke the cancellation clause, then to a resort in the Maldives I had bookmarked months ago, and finally, to my husband. When I told him we were leaving for a private ceremony 9,000 miles away, he didn't ask about the deposit or the logistics. He just asked when we needed to be at SeaTac Airport. 5 days later, the humiliation reached a new peak when a colleague from the hospital tagged me in an Instagram story featuring a photo of a gold-foiled invitation for a double wedding at Cedarwood Mansion. My mother and my aunt had already printed and mailed 150 invitations to our extended family, our coworkers, and even my department head at the hospital, all without me ever saying yes. My name was printed in a font 3 sizes smaller than my cousin's, a footnote in my own life, while the family believed I was happily sharing my day. I stood in the oncology ward, watching the world celebrate a lie. And for the first time in my 33 years, I didn't feel the need to correct them. Because I knew the venue was already gone, and the foundation of their social spectacle was nothing but a legal void. The month of March in Seattle is a season of persistent, silver-gray drizzle that seems to soak into the very architecture of the city. But inside the pediatric unit, the air is always filtered, sterile, and eerily still. I spent my shifts navigating the narrow corridors of the oncology wing, managing chemotherapy protocols and IV pumps for children who faced their mortality with more grace than any adult I had ever known. The contrast between the life and death stakes of my profession and the superficial predatory demands of my family began to feel like a physical fever burning behind my eyes. While I was charting patient vitals and holding the hands of parents who were praying for a miracle, my mother was busy in a group text with 24 people debating whether the hand-calligraphed place cards for the double wedding should be gold leaf or rose copper. I watched the notifications pile up on my lock screen. Messages from my aunt about luxury floral arches, and from my cousin about custom-branded cocktail napkins. And I realized they weren't just planning a party. They were building a shrine to a version of me that didn't exist. A version that was happy to be a financial donor to its own erasure. 2 weeks after I canceled the Cedarwood Mansion contract, I drove out to Snohomish to help my mother clear out some administrative files in her home office. A small room packed with library journals and school district paperwork that smelled of dust and stale coffee. I was looking for a notarized deed for my grandmother's property, but tucked behind a stack of property tax assessments in a manila folder, I found a document that made the oxygen in the room feel like it was turning to lead. It was a copy of a small business administration loan application for my aunt's luxury boutique in Bellevue, dated 3 years ago, with my own Social Security number neatly typed into the cosigner field and a signature that looked terrifyingly like my own handwriting. I stood there in the quiet of that room, the Pacific Northwest rain tapping against the glass like a metronome, realizing that Beverly, the woman who had taught me how to write my name, had actually used that name to secure a $40,000 business liability for her sister, while I was still working overtime shifts just to pay off my nursing school loans. I stood in my mother's office holding a forged document that proved she had risked my entire financial future to buy her sister's approval before I even knew how to protect myself. If you know what it feels like to find out your identity was a tool for the people who were supposed to be your shield, leave a heart below, like and subscribe, because the depth of that betrayal was a secret I had to carry while I smiled through a dinner that felt like an execution. The psychological weight of that discovery sat in my chest like a stone as I drove back toward downtown Seattle, passing the tech campuses and the high-rise developments that defined a world of wealth I was apparently underwriting without my own knowledge. I realized then that the $83,000 I had tallied in my spreadsheet was only the liquid capital they had drained from me. The true cost of my family was a debt that could have bankrupted my future before it even started. My brother, Grant Bennett, stopped by my apartment later that evening, his HVAC apprentice uniform stained with the grease and dust of a 10-hour day, his face glowing with a pride that made my stomach turn. He told me that our mother had finally released the $7,200 for his final certification exams, a check she claimed was the result of 5 years of careful savings from her librarian salary. I sat there at my kitchen island, watching my brother's relief, and I remembered the exact wire transfer I had sent our mother in February for what she called an emergency sewer line repair that she swore was undocumented and uninsured. I realized in that moment that she wasn't just stealing my money, she was stealing my virtue, taking the funds I earned in the ICU and presenting them to my brother as her own maternal sacrifice so she could keep his loyalty, while I remained the lucky one who was too selfish to help. The double wedding pressure reached a fever pitch during a Saturday night dinner at my aunt's house in Bellevue, a modern glass and steel structure that overlooked the Lake Washington waterfront and felt as cold as a surgical suite. My aunt, Evelyn, was in her element, pouring expensive Chardonnay and discussing the valet parking logistics for June 14th, while my cousin sat across from me, her iPad propped open to a mood board that was a marketing masterclass in narcissism. My name and my husband's name appeared exactly once on the digital seating chart, buried in a font so small it was almost illegible, while Cassidy and her fiancé occupied the center stage of every visual slide. I watched as my mother leaned over to admire a floral mock-up that would cost more than 3 months of my mortgage payments, her eyes bright with the reflected light of a social standing she was buying with my stolen identity. She reached over and patted my hand, telling the table that I was so dedicated to my patients that I had no room for beauty in my life, which was why the family had to step in and handle the sophisticated details of my own wedding. I looked at my husband, the architect who spent his days designing skyscrapers with structural integrity, and I saw the way he was counting the minutes until we could leave that toxic atmosphere. He knew about the cancellation, he knew about the Maldives, and he knew that the Bellevue socialites at that table were currently dining on the vapor of a contract that I had already burned to the ground. Before we left, my aunt pulled me into the foyer, her designer silk wrap rustling in the quiet, and told me that she expected a check for $4,200 by Monday morning to cover the premium champagne and the oyster bar. She said it with a smile that was as sharp as a lancet, reminding me that since I was a senior nurse at a top-tier hospital, it was my privilege to ensure the family's reputation remained untarnished in front of the 200 guests she had invited. I didn't argue, and I didn't refuse. I just walked out into the Seattle night, the damp air hitting my face like a clarification. I realized that Beverly, Evelyn, and Cassidy didn't see me as a daughter, a niece, or a cousin. They saw me as a commodity, a low-interest loan with a pulse, and I was exactly 91 days away from defaulting on their expectations for the rest of my life. The middle of April in Seattle brought a rare, temporary lull to the pediatric oncology ward, a stretch of silence where the infusion pumps hummed in a steady chorus, and the hospital air felt less like a pressure cooker and more like a sanctuary. I spent most of those graveyard shifts sitting in the darkened rooms of children who were finally sleeping, watching the monitor displays pulse with the steady green lines of their survival. And I found myself retreating into the quiet of my own thoughts. It was a breath beat I desperately needed, a chance to exist as a nurse and a woman rather than a financial resource. And for a few days, I almost allowed myself to believe that the bridge I was building to the Maldives was just a vacation and not a frantic escape. I sat in my Subaru for 20 minutes every morning before going into my apartment, just watching the streetlights flicker on across the Puget Sound. And I think most of us know that feeling, that moment when the world outside is too loud and the world inside is too heavy, and the only peace you have is the silence between two closed doors. On the third Tuesday of the month, my phone buzzed with a name that usually only appeared on my screen during the mandatory holiday dinners: Eleanor Bennett. My grandmother, Eleanor Bennett, 84 years old, sharp as a tax audit, and living at Maple Grove Senior Residence in Salem, was the woman who had raised my mother and my aunt with a discipline that had clearly been weaponized by the next generation. Her voice was thin but steady, like the sound of old parchment being unfolded in a quiet room. And she didn't waste time with the usual Pacific Northwest pleasantries about the rain or the cherry blossoms. She told me she had received a gold-foiled invitation in the mail with my name and my cousin's name printed side by side. And then she asked the only question that no one in my biological family had bothered to utter in 7 years. She asked if I was actually happy about it. I sat in the hospital break room, surrounded by the smell of stale coffee and industrial disinfectant, and I couldn't answer her right away, because the simple weight of her concern felt like a physical blow to my chest. I finally told her that nobody had ever asked me that, and I heard her sigh through the line, a long, weary sound that told me she knew exactly what kind of women my mother and my aunt had become. The quiet before the storm arrived on a Friday afternoon when I was called into a meeting with the director of nursing and a representative from Human Resources. I walked into the administrative suite expecting a routine discussion about budget allocations for the oncology wing, or perhaps a review of our staffing ratios for the upcoming fiscal quarter. But the atmosphere in the room was as cold as a morgue. The room was bright, the large windows overlooking the University of Washington campus, and for a moment, everything felt perfectly normal and professional, until the HR representative slid a printed copy of a formal complaint across the polished mahogany table. It was an anonymous report alleging that I was experiencing severe emotional instability and professional burnout that was compromising patient safety. And my heart stopped as I read the specific mentions of my erratic behavior during family planning sessions and my incapacity to handle stress. The only thought I had was that they weren't just stealing my money anymore. They were trying to dismantle the only part of myself I actually liked. And I realized with a cold, terrifying clarity that my aunt had used her social connections with a member of the hospital's foundation board to plant these seeds of doubt. She wanted to threaten my nursing license, the very thing that gave me the power to say no to them, thinking that if I felt my career was at risk, I would crawl back to the family for protection. I sat there in my navy blue scrubs, looking at the director, And I realized that my mother had likely provided the evidence for this report, twisting my exhaustion after overtime shifts into proof that I was mentally unfit to hold a syringe. I sat at my kitchen table that night and watched the spreadsheet total hit $83,000. 7 years of my life and my labor gone to people who couldn't even remember my birthday and were now trying to destroy my professional reputation just to keep their grip on my checkbook. If this hits you somewhere deep, tell me what you would have done. Like and subscribe. Because I was done being the only one at the table who was paying for the meal. I spent the next 4 hours at my laptop, not just updating the spreadsheet, but compiling my performance reviews, my commendations from oncologists, and the patient satisfaction scores that proved I was one of the most capable nurses on the floor. I realized that my aunt's luxury boutique in Bellevue wasn't just a business. It was a command center for her ego, and she was willing to commit professional sabotage to ensure my cousin's wedding had the premium open bar she felt entitled to. My mother's role in this was the deepest wound. The woman who had watched me study for the NCLEX by flashlight was now the woman signing off on a report that called my sanity into question, just to keep the peace with her sister. I didn't call my mother to scream, and I didn't send an angry text to my aunt, because I knew that in the American healthcare system, facts are the only currency that matters. Instead, I forwarded the HR report and the SBA loan documents I'd found in the manila folder to my lawyer friend, Sarah Bennett, 36 years old, a partner at a firm in downtown Seattle, and told her that we weren't just looking at a civil dispute anymore. I went back to the hospital for my next shift, my senior nurse badge pinned to my chest like a shield, and I performed my duties with a precision that was undeniable, even as the group texts continued to ping in my pocket with questions about shuttle bus schedules and hors d'oeuvres. I felt like a ghost moving through my own life, a woman who was already halfway to the Indian Ocean, watching her family sharpen their knives for a reception that didn't exist, while I quietly prepared the legal documentation that would eventually turn their social spectacle into a deposition. The final weeks of May in the Pacific Northwest are a blur of blooming rhododendrons and the frantic celebratory energy of graduation season. But for me, they were a masterclass in the art of the silent exit. I moved through my shifts at the hospital like a machine, my senior nurse scrubs acting as a second skin that hid the woman who was quietly dismantling her entire life in the margins of her overtime hours. While my cousin was busy posting "Countdown to the Big Day" reels on Instagram to her 12,000 followers, showing off swatches of silk and designer heels, I was at my kitchen table with my husband, Elliot Graham, finalizing the wire transfers for our private villa at a Maldives resort. I attended one last planning brunch at a waterfront restaurant in Kirkland, nodding as my mother discussed the logistics of the shuttle buses she'd chartered for the 200 guests who still believed I was their host. I sat there eating a smoked salmon scramble, watching her face, the woman who had stolen $83,000 from me and was now smiling as she planned a party on a foundation of forged signatures. And I realized that the woman I called my mother was a stranger I had been subsidizing for my entire adult life. On the morning of June 12th, we drove to SeaTac Airport in the pre-dawn gray, the Seattle mist clinging to the windows of our Subaru like a shroud. Our carry-on bags were light, and our boarding passes for the flight to Dubai were tucked into our passports, representing a freedom I hadn't felt since before I'd cashed my first paycheck. I stood in the airport terminal, looking out at the runways where the Boeing 777 sat waiting, and I stood there thinking, if I don't leave now, if I stay and try to explain one more time, I will spend the rest of my life as a liability in someone else's financial ledger. There was no guilt in that moment, only a clinical clarity as I turned my phone to airplane mode and felt the plane lift off, leaving the Space Needle and the Puget Sound behind. We arrived in the Maldives 48 hours later, a world of electric blue water and white sand that didn't require a seating chart, an HR report, or a loan application to enjoy. June 14th arrived like a fever dream. While the sun was setting over the Indian Ocean, casting long copper shadows across the beach, it was barely sunrise back in Seattle, and the parallel timelines of our lives were about to collide with the force of a freight train. I stood on the sand in a $380 chiffon dress, my bare feet sinking into the warm white grains, and I watched my husband promise to be my family. A real family that didn't run on guilt, interest rates, or professional sabotage. There were no 200 guests, no Dungeness crab, and no aunt to tell me my aesthetic wasn't sophisticated enough for her social circle. There was only the sound of the waves and the feeling of a clean slate. Back in Woodinville wine country, the clock hit 4 p.m., and the quiet before the storm finally broke. The guests began arriving at Cedarwood Mansion in summer suits and cocktail dresses, the valet parking line stretching down the drive as the Oregon sun actually cooperated for once. My mother and my aunt stood at the entrance in lavender and teal, acting as the regents of a kingdom that had already been liquidated, while my cousin was inside the bridal suite in a $4,000 designer gown that was currently sitting on a maxed-out credit card. At 4:15 p.m., the venue coordinator, Claire Sterling, 45, a professional who had managed hundreds of high-end events, walked out to the garden where the guests were milling about in confusion. She didn't approach the crowd. She went directly to my mother and spoke with the measured precision of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. She informed her that the contract under the name Audrey Bennett had been canceled on March 14th, and that the mansion was currently being prepped for a corporate retreat beginning at 7 p.m. My mother's face reportedly went from the flush of social triumph to a cadaverous white in under 5 seconds as she realized the ballroom doors were locked and the caterers she thought she'd coordinated were never hired. I looked at the boarding pass for the Maldives and then at the 47 missed calls from the woman who claimed I was no longer her daughter because I finally said no. If you think I made the right choice, drop a yes or no in the comments, like and subscribe, because the silence that followed was the first time I could actually hear myself think. By 5 p.m., the Woodinville police had to be called to clear the manicured lawn as 200 guests stood in the afternoon heat with no ceremony, no food, and no bride. My cousin was allegedly found sitting on the floor of the empty lobby, her mascara streaking her expensive foundation, while my aunt screamed at the staff about contracts they didn't have. The humiliation was total, a public exposure of the lie they had tried to build on my back. And as the notifications began to flood my phone in the Maldives, I watched the disintegration from 9,000 miles away. My phone took nearly a minute to load the backlog of rage. 47 missed calls, 19 from my mother, 11 from my aunt, 5 from my brother. And then the text messages, a chronology of a family's collapse through the lens of a smartphone screen. The first few were confused, asking where I was, but by 5:30 p.m. Seattle time, the messages turned nuclear, the language shifting from confusion to vitriol. My mother's final text, 8 words that I will carry in the back of my mind until the day I die, read, "You are no longer my daughter. We're done." I sat on the deck of our overwater villa, the Indian Ocean breathing beneath me, and I realized that for the first time in my 33 years, her threat didn't feel like a sentence. It felt like a pardon. I didn't answer her that night. I didn't defend my choice, and I didn't explain the spreadsheet or the forged SBA loan. I simply set the phone face down on the teak nightstand and watched the light from the Pacific Northwest sunset, which I knew was happening a world away, fade into the tropical dark. I was a senior nurse who had spent her life managing the acute pain of others, and for the first time, I was allowing myself to feel my own without trying to medicate it with compliance. The quiet before the storm was over, and the wreckage was exactly where it belonged, in the hands of the people who had built it. The phone rang at 3:12 a.m. Maldives time. I had been drifting in and out of a restless sleep, the kind of half-consciousness where your body is resting, but your mind is replaying every IV infusion rate and patient chart from the last 7 years. Beside me, my husband was breathing slow and even, a man whose conscience was as clear as the Indian Ocean outside our villa. I watched the screen of my iPhone pulse on the teak nightstand, the name Mom glowing in the dark like a warning light on a ventilator. I sat up in bed, the white chiffon dress I had worn for our ceremony draped over a chair in the corner, a ghost of the woman I used to be. I watched the phone pulse 4 times before I finally slid the bar to answer, and I didn't say a word. I let the silence of the Maldives night travel 9,000 miles back to the Pacific Northwest. My mother didn't start with a greeting. She started with a raw, jagged rasp that told me she had been screaming at a locked door in Woodinville for hours. She wanted to know if I had any idea what she had gone through. 200 guests staring at her like she was a common fraud. The shuttle buses she'd chartered idling in a parking lot with nowhere to go. And my aunt, Evelyn Thorne, standing in the middle of a manicured garden with a daughter in a designer gown and no ballroom to host her spectacle. I listened to her voice. A woman who had spent 58 years as a high school librarian organizing the lives of others. And I realized she was finally facing a story she couldn't edit. I told her, in the same clinical tone I used to deliver prognoses to parents in the ICU, that I had never agreed to share my wedding. I told her she had sent a forged email to a coordinator pretending I had given consent, that she had printed invitations with my name on them without a single phone call, and that she had treated my life like a stage production for my cousin. When she tried to run the old guilt trip playbook, telling me that family shares and that I made a good senior nurse salary, I hit her with the only number that mattered. I told her the total was $83,247. I asked her if she wanted me to go line by line through the Venmo transfers, the checks for the Camry, and the $7,000 I'd wired for my brother's HVAC certification that she had claimed came from her own savings. The silence on the other end of the line was the longest 8 seconds of my life. A heavy, suffocating silence that told me she had finally run out of rationalizations. I told her she had no longer earned the right to call me her daughter, and I hung up. The sound of the Maldives waves returning to fill the room like a cleansing breath. The next morning, while the sun was hitting the turquoise water with a radiance that made everything in Seattle feel like a distant, gray memory, I opened my MacBook and navigated to our family group chat on Facebook Messenger. There were 24 members, every aunt, uncle, and cousin from Snohomish to Spokane. I didn't type an angry manifesto, and I didn't engage in the digital warfare my family was expecting. I simply uploaded the 14-page PDF that my attorney had reviewed, the one that documented every financial interaction from 2017 to 2025. I told them I wasn't sending it to be malicious, but because the truth deserved to exist somewhere other than my own hard drive. I watched the read receipts tick upward. 5, 9, 14, 21. 21 people in my family sat in their homes across Washington state and read the ledger of my exploitation. The fallout was a systemic collapse of the Bennett family hierarchy. Within 48 hours, the group chat was hemorrhaging members like a punctured artery. My Aunt Linda and Uncle Greg were the first to leave, sending me a private message that they were gutted to realize my mother had been using me as a silent bank account while they were all told I was doing so well. My cousin, Cassidy Thorne, went dark on social media, her follower count dropping as the story of the empty ballroom spread through the Bellevue social scene, a viral humiliation she couldn't filter away. But the real aftershock happened with my brother, Grant Bennett. He called me on the third day, his voice thick with a shame I never wanted him to carry. He told me our mother had looked him in the eye and said the $7,000 for his trade school was the result of her extra librarian shifts and years of maternal sacrifice. He promised to pay me back every cent, even if he had to work double shifts on HVAC calls for the next 5 years. I told him he didn't owe me money. He only owed it to himself never to let anyone turn him into a resource the way they had turned me. When we landed back at SeaTac Airport on June 20th, the air smelled of jet fuel, pine needles, and the specific Pacific Northwest dampness that usually made me feel heavy. But this time, I felt as light as the chiffon in my suitcase. We drove our Subaru back to our apartment in West Seattle, the skyline glowing in the distance, and I realized that the woman who had left 10 days earlier was a ghost I had finally laid to rest. I didn't open the 112 unread messages from my mother or my aunt. Instead, I followed the professional protocols I had learned in the hospital. I triaged the noise and only focused on what was critically stable. I met with the director of nursing and presented the forged loan documents and the timeline of the harassment, effectively neutralizing the burnout report my aunt had tried to use as a surgical strike against my career. My director didn't just clear my record. She told me the hospital board had been watching my performance in the oncology wing and offered me a promotion to nurse manager. The promotion came with a 6-figure salary of $104,000, a financial milestone that felt like more than just a raise. It felt like the final brick in the fortress I was building around my own life. A week later, I sat at my kitchen island with Elliot Graham and a legal pad, the most unglamorous tool in the world, and we wrote out our new boundaries in permanent ink. No more emergency wires, no more holiday checks, and no more unpaid consulting for family members who only called when the utility bill was late. I realized that since I had stopped the family tax, our joint savings had increased by nearly $5,000 in just 8 weeks, a liquidity that would have been drained away by my mother's emergencies in any other year. The quiet before the storm had been replaced by a quiet after the storm, a period of reconstruction where I only invited people to my table who actually wanted me there. We hosted a small dinner for 6 people, my brother, my attorney friend, and a few close nursing colleagues. And as I served the Dungeness crab and the organic salad, I realized the total cost of the evening was $47. It was the cheapest and most fulfilling family dinner I had ever hosted, because it was the first one where I wasn't the only one paying the price for the atmosphere. We talked about the architecture of my husband's new project and my brother's HVAC career, and for 3 hours, no one mentioned Bellevue, Instagram, or the $83,000. My mother didn't call me for 5 weeks, a silence that I eventually learned was her being ostracized from her social circle in Snohomish. After the spreadsheet was forwarded through her church network, she was asked to step down from the holiday committee, and she spent her days in the high school library realizing that her reputation was as void as the Cedarwood Mansion contract. When she finally called me on a rainy Saturday in August, her voice was small and brittle. She didn't lead with a guilt trip, and she didn't mention my aunt's boutique audit. She just told me she had read my email several times and that she was sorry. She said the word wrong about the forged email she'd sent the coordinator, a word I hadn't heard her use in 33 years. It wasn't a full reconciliation, and it wasn't a refund for the 7 years she'd stolen, but it was a crack in the wall that I was willing to leave open, as long as she stayed on her side of it. I wrote a final handwritten letter to my grandmother Eleanor in Salem, enclosing a photo of me and my husband on the beach, looking like two people who had finally found their bearings. When she called me back, her voice warmer than the summer sun, she told me she had hung the picture right next to her bed and that she was proud of me for choosing to be happy. I realized then that family isn't a blood contract you sign at birth. It's a fiduciary duty to the people who actually see you. And by that definition, my grandmother, my husband, and my brother were the only beneficiaries I had left. My mother lost her standing at the Snohomish County Library Board and is currently living on her base salary with no financial supplements from her successful daughter. My aunt, Evelyn Thorne, is facing a private civil suit regarding the unauthorized SBA loan, and her Bellevue boutique is under financial audit that will likely end in its liquidation. My cousin's wedding was indefinitely postponed after her fiancé realized the extravagance he'd been promised was a mirage built on my student loans. I have a nurse manager title, a retirement account that is finally growing, and a husband who asks me every morning what I need instead of what I owe. I finally understand that loyalty without reciprocity is just a slow-motion robbery, and I am no longer a victim of my own compassion. I spent 7 years thinking that if I just kept the family infrastructure standing, I would eventually be allowed to live inside it. But I was just the foundation they were walking on while they looked for a better view. I don't wait for permission to set a boundary anymore, because I realized the only person who can define my worth is the woman who survived the oncology ward and the Snohomish guilt trips. I drive my Subaru to the hospital every morning, and I sleep through the night now, in my own house, with the doors locked, because there's nobody left to be afraid of. I drive my kids to school every morning now, in a truck I paid for with money I earned myself. And when we pass that old house on Ridgewood, I don't slow down anymore. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like and subscribe, because there is always someone sitting in their car right now trying to figure out what to do next.